This is the second interview in a series that we have called Conversations about the 60s in the Shoals. My name's Tom Osborne, and my colleague here is Ansley Kuros. It's the 2nd of December, 2014, and we're at the Florence-Lauderdale Public Library. Our conversation today is with George Carpenter, and we're going to ask him a good deal about his memories growing up, as well as his uncle, Carl Elliott, the congressman. So, welcome, George.
Thank you.
Thank you for agreeing to meet with us and talk about your memories and tell us some stories.
It's an honor, thank you.
The main way in which I am familiar with any part of what you might have to say is this book, Cost of Courage. Would you like to say anything about the book?
Yeah, I remember in, I think it was 1990, my children were young teenagers. I think I had a high schooler and a middle schooler, and we had an opportunity to go to Boston to see Carl Elliott receive the first John F. Kennedy Profiles in Courage Award, and got to meet lots of the Kennedys and Kennedy children, and including Jackie Onassis, which was a delight. But out of that publicity and Carl having an opportunity to meet lots of people who could influence the birth of this book, including a writer from the Boston Globe who has done an extensive article, who did at that time an extensive series of articles about Carl, and I can't recall his name, but the short version is that Carl wound up getting connected with Michael Dorso, and he came to Jasper a number of times and would stay long periods of time with Carl, and met a lot of people who were hands-on involved in all of that, and in all of that story, and lots of the brothers and sisters and former campaign workers and supporters and different things, and most of whom have since passed away. But I remember going back and forth to Jasper and meeting Michael a couple of times, and we just as a family sat in anticipation of that book coming out, and I remember getting it and reading it for the first time and thinking, wow, I mean, this reads like a novel. This is really good, and because some of those kinds of books, some of that genre of books have over the years been somewhat disappointing to me, but I thought it was really good, and it was just it was really nice to be able to see the conception of it, and the gestation of it, and the birth of it, and the whole thing, and I really it's been something that all of our family has been extremely proud of, and we've probably given away more copies of it than were ever sold. But I think it's really it's a remarkable story of that time. It is very well done, and has some insights in there that are not commonly known about.
Mr. Carpenter, can you tell us one of your favorite stories or episodes from the book? Was there one that stuck out to you that you read and thought, I didn't know that, or that really struck you?
I remember in there, one of the things I remember learning that I did not know was that in the 1966 gubernatorial campaign, there were, I don't remember, 8 or 9 candidates. That was the year that George Wallace could not run for re-election. There was a two-term limit in Alabama, which I guess is still the law. But he could not run for re-election and was unable to change that law in his second term of government. So he ran his wife Lurleen as a candidate for governor that year. And in spite of the fact that we now know she was dying of cancer at that time, but the person who finished second was a fellow named Richmond Flowers from, I believe he was from Tuscaloosa and had been in the legislature and had maybe been a DA down there or something. I remember reading in that book the story of how Carl met with Dr. King and said, please give me your support. I cannot win this election without your endorsement. And they met for a long time, discussed a lot of different things, but ultimately Dr. King and the NAACP, whatever the organization was at that time, I guess it was the same, wound up endorsing Richmond Flowers. And Richmond Flowers had, that was the whole point of his campaign, was he was out to get the black vote. And what Martin Luther King tells Uncle Carl in that book there was, you know, I want to do this for you. I think you're probably right, but this is not what my people want, and I've got to do what my people want me to do. And I had never heard that story. I was not aware of that story. I knew that Carl's candidacy did not get the endorsement, but I didn't understand all the background about why. So I remember that's one of the things. It's been a long time since I read that book, but it's that's one of the stories that I did.
Can we take you back to earlier times? What are your tell us about your family relationship. We're kind of taking this for granted, but describe the family to us and your place in it and Carl's place in it.
Carl was the oldest of 9 children of G.W. and Nora Elliott. There's a picture of the family in there, mom and dad and all the grown children. See, Carl was the oldest. I believe my mother was 4th in birth order, and we would have it was a very, in my estimation, in my experience, a very, very unique family, because neither of the parents ever finished high school, and all 9 of the children finished college. All of them growing up during all or part of the Depression, and the stories in there about Carl walking to the University of Alabama with $1.28 in his pocket and winding up being student government president. I mean, it was it's an incredible story. I mean, his courage started a long time before his politics did, but all of the, for all of those children to be such achievers is remarkable by itself. Another thing is that I went to that family, all of us aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents, as long as they were alive, we celebrated Christmas Eve in the same house, in my case, for 48 consecutive years. And I had 20-something first cousins. I knew every one of them. We visited in each other's homes. Christmas wasn't the only time I saw most of them. One of the cousins wound up buying that house from the brothers and sisters after the parents were gone, and the brothers and sisters got too old and too many of them had passed away to continue on with that tradition. One of my cousins bought the house, and until this year, when some sickness became an impediment, she had everyone down, not on Christmas Eve, but on the Saturday before Christmas. So we started yet another tradition. For that, and during all that time, way before I was born, they were getting together on Christmas Eve. Whoever could come would come, and that lasted through World War II, it's just a very close family. I have two cousins in particular, that are more like brother and sister than cousins, and that live here nearby. And I was a month ago down in Alabaster at the funeral of my oldest cousin, and there were a bunch of us there. And it's remarkable that I told someone that I went to that funeral because I knew my mother would haunt me if I didn't go. We were encouraged to be. Family was everything. We were encouraged to be that way, and it was. To me, that's incredible. I don't think you see that much anymore. You might be Facebook friends, but that's kind of taking the place of some of the real stuff.
What do you remember about your Uncle Carl as a child, growing up at all those Christmas Eves?
I remember he was huge. He was 6'4", and a very imposing figure. He took his role as the patriarch of the family very seriously, and he every year he would hold forth with the family before we could open any presents or anything. He'd get everybody in the big living room there, and he would tell us about the family. He'd tell us some family history. He wrote 4 volumes called Annals of Northwest Alabama, and he was very well versed in who was kin to who and who came from where, and if you're interested in that and want to see them, I doubt if you can find them, but I've got access to them. He wrote a history of Red Bay, Alabama. This great big, but he was just always fascinated by genealogies and family histories and that kind of thing. So he knew a lot about our family, and I learned from him at those. We were kids; we couldn't wait for it to get over with. But I remember learning from him that he had traced the Massey family. His mother was a Massey. He had traced the Massey family all the way back to the Magna Carta, and he knew about them coming to America and being in North Carolina and coming to Alabama before it was ever Alabama. And he just told us, he just knew so much about, and really knew he had been able to unearth more about the Massey family than the Elliott family, but he just had an incredible mind, incredible memory. But I guess as a child, I most of all remember him being a big, imposing figure.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember him always giving, he would come with a pocket full of silver dollars, and he would give a silver dollar to any child in the family who had made straight A's, and I never got one.
No.
To the disappointment of my mother. But
that love of education, the importance of education, comes through in almost everything in the book. Tell us that wonderful story of him going to Tuscaloosa, going to college with nothing in his pocket.
Well, I obviously can't tell that as well as the book tells it, but he credits his mother with, who could not read very well, but he credits his mother with his love of reading and learning. And he had to have been a man who was gifted with a lot of natural intelligence, and he talks in there about both of his parents being active in politics, and there's a story about him or about his mother when rural electrification, I guess administration was what it was called at that time, started putting the lights in. And started in Russellville and were working their way out through Franklin County. And when they got to their house, someone asked her where that light came from, and she said, "From God and Mr. Roosevelt." and that's kind of the way they looked at things. But
That's a great quote.
She also said, when the children got together and bought her first electric stove, that she wouldn't give you a nickel for every one of those you could stack from there to the moon. She wanted her wood stove back. But anyway, back to Carl. He just was so driven to learn, had such a desire for learning, that when he graduated from high school, he made up his mind he was going to go to the University of Alabama. And they had nothing. I mean, he was born in 1914. And so he would have been 18 years later, 17 years later, whatever age. I think graduated from Alabama in 33 or 36 or something. That's all in there. But I mean, just in the teeth of the Depression, and got some rides along the way, but basically walked to Tuscaloosa. And Dr. George Denny was the president of the university, and he said, "I want to go to school here." And Dr. Denny said, "Well, you can't. You don't have the resources. You don't have any place to stay, and the details of the deal they cut are in the book, and I don't remember those exactly, but they worked out an arrangement somehow through the persistence of Carl that he would work on campus in the cafeteria and sleep in the campus observatory. He slept his first few days under a truck, just to have shelter, but would sleep in the campus observatory, and he did that. The job, I don't know if that housing arrangement continued through his entire time, but continued that job. He is reputed to have spilled a pitcher of tea on the woman who later became Lady Bird Johnson at the University of Alabama. And continued that until he graduated, and not only graduated, but graduated with high honors and as president of student body. Stayed there, went on to law school. I mean, it's just, you know, it's just a different time, and I mean, they really were the greatest generation. And it's
That's quite a wonderful story. But the certainty that, the confidence that he had, although he had nothing, and the perseverance. It's really a remarkable story.
mm-hmm.
Let me ask you one other question. This struck me when you were talking about your Christmases with the family, that your Uncle Carl is from Northwest Alabama, took great pride in that, knew the history of the area so well. And so he's definitely a man from the Shoals, from Northwest Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
But in some ways it's such an anomaly coming out of the region. Where do you think his unique views came from?
Do you mean his views on race relations in particular? You know, my mother and I have talked about that in the past, and I don't know that I have a good answer for that, and she didn't either. My mother said that they lived in what's called Freedom Hills in Franklin County. She said that she was, and my mother graduated from high school at 16 and went to Jacksonville State with nothing herself a few years later. But anyway, she said that she was 17, 18 years old before she ever saw a black person. That everybody she was ever around in her entire life was white and dirt poor, and that the black people that she met through Jacksonville State and once she got away from Freedom Hills were as bad off, or were better off than she was. And that the few black people that were around, that some of her siblings had known, were as bad off as they were. I mean, they didn't, you know, they were all starving to death together. And I don't know whether that's an explanation or not, but maybe because of that background, they learned that there really was not any difference. I don't have any explanation other than that, but perhaps that's what it was. That when Carl was inspired to do the legislation that started the bookmobile program. He didn't want white people to be able to have access to a book. He wanted everybody to have access to a book. And perhaps the reason for that was that he had learned early on that, you know, they were all poor together. Perhaps that was it. I don't know.
Do you remember him talking much about race as a child growing up? Do you remember hearing a lot about it?
No. I do remember that that this was not just a way that he felt. I remember that that his position was consistent with the position of my aunts and uncles, that it wasn't just him. he was an anomaly within the family. He was an anomaly maybe within society.
Right.
But I can remember in the early 60s, during the difficult times of race relations, that the rumor went around Tuscumbia that black people were going to come to the churches and start attending the churches in Tuscumbia, and that they weren't doing that to worship, they were doing that to disrupt, or at least that was the white version of it. And so the church that we were attending at the time decided that they would post 2 or 3 of the men outside the church and not let anybody in that they didn't want in.
What church was that then?
That was the First Baptist Church in Tuscumbia.
Baptist, okay.
But other churches did that too.
Sure.
But I remember that my dad wouldn't do that. He would not let them recruit him to do that. And I remember thinking as a child that being kind of disappointed about that my dad wasn't one of the tough guys, you know. And figuring out after my parents talked to me about what his reasoning for that was, and figuring out that he had done the right thing, you know, I remember my mother, who was a school teacher in Tuscumbia for 31 years, embracing integration and embracing the, you know, I have people come up to me today, black and white, to tell me how they loved my mother and how my mother's the reason they stayed in school, or my mother's the reason they learned this or that, or my mother, your mother was the first teacher I ever had. I heard your mother in the 6th grade, and she was the first teacher that I ever had that figured out that there was something wrong with me and I wasn't just stupid, and this particular fellow had dyslexia, and you know, people didn't really know what that was then, so I was fortunate enough to come from a situation where for both my parents, you didn't have this attitude of divisiveness and difference and lines being drawn, and so I was very fortunate.
Did any black Americans ever come to try to integrate First Baptist?
No.
It was just a precautionary conversation.
Yeah, it probably wasn't even true.
Yeah. Well, it
You
kind
know.
of did happen around the area, but
Well, but see, in another chapter of that story in Tuscumbia is that when I think I was in the 9th grade when the schools integrated, and you know, we'd been seeing all this stuff on television about all these bad things that had happened in Birmingham and places, or Nashville and places, and it was all tense, and not one thing happened. You know, there were no more playground fights than there were the year before. I mean, it was not one thing. There was no demonstration. There was no rock thrown. And I look back on that now and realize, or have realized in my adulthood, that there were some people in the white community and the people in the black community in Tuscumbia back in those years that both had too much to lose to let that happen. There was a strong middle class in the white community, but a stronger than normal middle class in the black community at that time, in Tuscumbia and Sheffield and what is now Muscle Shoals and so forth, and in Florence too. You had people, black men and white men, already working together at the railroad and at Reynolds Metals and at Diamond Shamrock and TVA and especially TVA, who had hiring practices at that time that are as modern as the ones today, I suppose. But so you already had some in the parent and grandparent generations. You already had some assimilation going on, But the black leadership and the white leadership, I mean, I don't know what they worked out, but they apparently got together and worked out something, because we did not have problem one in Tuscany. In fact, we had our 45th class reunion this past summer, and at the dinner I sat next to Teresa Horton, who is Teresa something else now, a black girl who, and she beat me in the civics bee. I finished second, she finished first, and I told her I was still mad at her about that. And she has gone on to a very successful career as a lawyer with NASA. But it just, you know, you mentioned earlier that sometimes the stories, that sometimes people's observations are a lot different than what was on the news, and mine certainly was. We had a very quiet, uneventful segregation.
Desegregation.
Desegregation, yes.
Probably a quiet, uneventful segregation as well. But
Yeah, probably.
desegregation too.
Desegregation is what I meant.
Yes, sir. It's so interesting. Do you remember being nervous about your Uncle Carl and what he was involved in, or as a child, and when all this was happening? Did you follow his career, or were you like, oh, Uncle Carl's in politics?
In 62, I believe it was, when he was in Congress, there were a group of us who went to Washington, and in fact, there may be a picture played in that book of this time that I'm about to tell you about, but a group of us went to Washington, 3 or 4 of the aunts and uncles and some cousins, and I think there were 3 cars. Drove up to Washington, and we got sort of the grand tour because of Carl being a congressman, and we got to get in the front of the line to go through the White House, and we didn't have to go through with the group of common people. We got to go through with our own, just our family went through with the guide and everything, and we got to sit in the gallery in the Capitol and watch legislation process, and we got to probably don't want this on the tape, but I used the urinal next to the Speaker of the House in the bathroom in the Capitol. It was just from a child's perspective, it was really exciting, because, I mean, it was one thing to be in the nation's capital and to be able to see all that stuff, but it was another thing to be treated like we were really somebody. That was a big deal. And so I was certainly interested in it from that standpoint. Carl's career as a congressman ended in '64 when the state of Alabama was not able to redistrict itself. The state had lost enough population in the 1960 census that we lost a congressman. We went from 9 down to 8. And so Governor Wallace, who had by this time become a staunch enemy of Carl, the short version is that he engineered something called the 9-8 plan, where every congressman had to run all at the same time, and the top 8 vote getters would be the remaining 8 congressmen, and whoever was eliminated, they would assimilate those counties into the other districts. Well, that was designed to, and ultimately did, eliminate Carl. For one of the reasons was that Carl had the largest district in land area, but the fewest population. So if everybody voted for their own congressman, then he's out. And the Wallace faction campaigned pretty heavily for him to be voted against, and ultimately it turned out just like they wanted it to. He finished ninth, and he was eliminated, and that set the stage for him running for governor in 1966. Well, by 1966, I was older. I was in, I don't know, 9th, 10th grade, something along in there, and so my parents and some of my aunts and uncles in this part of the state geared up for that campaign. And I remember doing my homework in motel rooms around the district, which did not include the Shoals. It was Franklin, Marion, Winston, those counties down that way. But we would go to rallies, but if it was a weeknight, they'd leave me in a motel room, and I'd do my homework, and they would come back and tell about what all. There's a lot. It was a different political process back in those days too. There were a lot of going to some schoolhouse, and the PTA would have a fundraiser, and it would be a bake sale and a dinner and this political speeches and all that, and a lot more hands-on. There wasn't a lot of the TV ads and that kind of thing. And I remember going to some of those and handing out cards and buttons, and I remember giving cards to people that would look at them and throw them on the ground and different kind of thing, because if you worked for Wallace, you were just a nobody. And so I remember that being a little scary about feeling in the minority, feeling like I was on the wrong side of the tracks, but I also remember feeling not being unable to feel energized about that, because I was constantly hearing from my mother how right we were. So I think I told. I'm not sure this is in that book, but I remember the story about. You remember me telling you about Mary Jolly the other day.
Yeah.
The night of the 1966 gubernatorial race, the votes were in, and they were waiting for the votes to be counted, and it wasn't like it is today. It was going to be the next morning before enough results were in for them to have any idea about it. And Mary Jolly, who had been Carl's administrative assistant in Congress, and who her name was Mary Allen at the time, but she was riding in a car with Garv Ivy, who was a businessman from Walker County, and with Bill Baxley, who was later the Attorney General and is now a lawyer in Birmingham. Bill Baxley, I think, was still in law school at that time, but had gotten involved in the campaign and believed in the campaign and so forth. Garv and Mary and Bill were riding down the highway, I think going maybe back to Jasper or something, and Mary said, or somebody, they were talking about, it looks bad, and we don't think we're going to do well, this is not going to turn out right. And Mary said, oh yes it will. God is on our side. And Bill actually remembers Garv Ivy looking at her, and Garv Ivy, by the way, had gone broke twice in the chicken business in Walker County, and Garv looked at Mary and said, Mary, God doesn't care anything about politics and the chicken business. And I remember that, not from that time, but I just remember hearing about that story and just allegorically thinking how true that is. I think you could say now that God doesn't care anything about politics, the chicken business, or football, and it's just as true. But I remember this, and this is kind of a silly story, but I remember one of the campaign rallies. There was a time during the gubernatorial campaign that Carl had. Is that where he's standing on the back of a? Yeah, standing in the back of that old truck, and they would have rallies they'd pull up at a courthouse and have campaign speeches, and one of the ways before the campaign was over that they would draw a crowd was that they had Hank Williams Jr. and a band, and I remember we were doing a series of those rallies one day, and I got to ride on the bus with Hank Williams Jr. and the band and Hank Jr.'s mama and I mean, he didn't have anything to do with me. He went to the back, but I sat next to the drummer, who was real nice to me and paid me some attention, and I just thought that was the grandest thing in the world. And I mean, and Hank Williams Jr. is about a year older than me. He was just a kid himself, I just have a lot of memories of things like that, but not of a good outcome. I have my high school annual that year. There was a young man in my class who wrote his daddy was a big George Wallace guy, and he wrote in the annual the Wallace vote total and the Elliott vote total, and just great big numbers across the
just digging at you.
Just digging one more time, yeah. And but I will go to my grave being a lot prouder of Carl Elliott than I will ever be of George Wallace. And that's I'd rather be on that side. I sure would.
Now, part of his life and career that you may have been more aware of because he would be older is after he left politics and the financial situation that he lived with as a result of that election, having to take his entire congressional pension to pay for the campaign.
Yeah, he was financially devastated by the campaign and never had anything until, he died just, he was 89 years old when he died and was just living hand to mouth. I think I'm telling this right, just as an example of his situation, that the bank in Jasper foreclosed on his house and then rented it to him until he died, and he lost. He had 2 sons and 2 daughters. Both of his sons predeceased him. His wife predeceased him. But he, in his law practice, he primarily represented people who were trying to get Social Security and people who were trying to get black lung benefits. And that always impressed me because he never gave up on trying to help people who were worse off than he was, or help people who were beaten down for one reason or another by their circumstances. And he never accepted opportunities to go to Washington and be a lobbyist, and he sort of never went over to the dark side, as I like to put it. He struggled a lot more with the death of his wife and his sons than he did with his financial circumstances. I mean, he got by and scraped enough money, but I remember when he got the when he got the Cost of Courage Award, the first ever Kennedy Cost of Courage Award, there was a $10,000 financial award or something, and I remember, and I don't know whatever happened to the money, but I remember there being some discussion amongst the brothers and sisters and some of the friends that money would probably have to go toward some of his creditors, that he would never actually get any of that. I assume that's what happened. I don't know, but Mary Jolly, who I've told you quite a bit about, after his death, she started up a campaign in Jasper that involved the Bevel Community College, and I don't know who all else, although Bevel Community College was very heavily involved in it. And they wound up buying Carl's house and fixing it up, making it presentable, and it's now a museum. And the Cost of Courage Award is on display sometimes in the Jasper Public Library and sometimes in the house. I think it's sort of a traveling exhibit, but that's Mary Jolly made it one of her many causes that Carl was not to be forgotten. And she has done a really good job of all of that. So I'll tell you another story about that reminds me of another story about our trip to Washington when I was a child. That was the first time I ever met Mary. But Mary put us in her car. Way more people than were supposed to be in a car back in the days before seatbelts. But she had all the cousins in her car, and she was driving us around Washington at night, showing us the Capitol lit up for the nighttime, and the Washington Monument lit up for nighttime, and the the Lincoln Memorial lit up for nighttime, and we're driving around. And she pulls up in this driveway of this big, beautiful, ornate building, gated and all. She pulls up and she says, "This is the British Embassy. So you can go home and tell your friends that while you were gone, you set foot on British soil." Backed out and went off down the road, and I've never forgotten that. And I still remind Mary from time to time when I see her about her taking us to the British soil.
What do you remember about your Uncle Carl's relationship with the Black community? His relationship with Dr. King? You mentioned that he and King corresponded. What do you remember about that?
Very little. Because I don't ever remember race ever really being an issue. I mean, he didn't he didn't come from a place of racial discrimination is wrong. He came from a place of poverty and lack of opportunity is wrong. So if you were black or if you were white and you were impoverished and did not have opportunity, then he threw the same net over you. And I don't ever remember it being a racial thing. It was a poverty thing.
Yeah.
And so there was not a in Carl's district, in that old what was at that time his congressional district, I bet you that way less than 10% of the population in that entire district was black. But a big percentage of them were poor, and a big percentage of them were uneducated, and a big percentage of them would never have opportunity to go to college. And his big, his biggest accomplishment, the thing that he was proudest of in his time in Congress, was the National Defense Education Act. And there's no telling how many thousands of people went to college with their education financed by the National Defense Education Act. And it didn't have anything to do with race. I mean, in his mind, it was never an opportunity for black or white. It was an opportunity for the poor and disadvantaged. So I don't, I just don't remember race ever being that much of a deal.
I understand. I'm wondering, I guess, more about the 1966 gubernatorial race, where certainly race was right there underneath the surface of the whole conversation.
Absolutely.
Of the whole election.
Absolutely.
So how did your uncle manage that? He obviously called King asking for an endorsement, which he knew was going to help get the black vote in the state. And that wasn't given to him. So he knew enough to say, I need these votes. And certainly Wallace is running Miss Lurleen on a racial ticket.
And I think and there's an account of this, I believe, in that book as well. And there was a I guess you would call it a blemish on his record, where he voted along with the rest of the Alabama delegation against some of the early civil rights legislation in an attempt to try to save his seat, because his position was, I can vote against this now and do something about it later. But he never got that chance because of being eliminated. But he cast a vote or two that were in line with the white supremacist and that kind of thing, in an effort to try to stay in Washington and do something else. And so he was very aware that, and of course I was a kid, I wasn't aware of this till later, but he was very aware that compromises had to be made and those kinds of things. So from that sense, he was very alert to the political comings and goings and the shifts but he became quite close. He was liberal enough, and when I say liberal, I mean 1960s liberal. He would have been probably nothing more than a slightly right moderate nowadays, but was considered very liberal back in that time. And even with the votes that he felt he had to cast, he still became quite close to President Kennedy. And President Kennedy appointed him to the Rules Committee, the most powerful committee in Congress. And there's a story in there about when he was the chairman of the Rules Committee tried his best to keep him off the committee, and told the president when Carl was appointed to the Rules Committee that he would not seat him. So his supporters in Walker County, or in his district, I don't think they were all from Walker, they made up money and bought him a chair and sent it to him as a symbolic gesture that if the chairman won't give you a chair, here's one for you. And but there's a story, and I think it may be in there, but President Kennedy came to the Shoals area in the spring of '63. Well, he was killed in November of '63, wasn't he? He came to the Shoals area in the spring of '63. And even in 1963, thousands of people went out there to see him, and the congressional congressional delegation was there. There were senators and congressmen from Mississippi and Tennessee and Alabama there. And, I mean, we were so far away we could barely see the stage, but thousands of people there. As I remember, there may have been hundreds, but to his biggest crowd I'd ever been in. And while President Kennedy was here, Carl was on the presidential helicopter with him, and President Kennedy said, "Isn't this where you're from?" And so President Kennedy got the helicopter to fly down over Franklin County, and Carl would say, now they'd be flying over, he'd say, now these people down here, they don't have a public water system, and these people down here, they're still waiting on electric power or whatever. So the Franklin County Water Authority came about by President Kennedy telling his chief of staff to put that in the next budget. They were flying over, looking at it out of the helicopter. So, yeah, he voted the wrong way a couple of times, but the president, the people that mattered, knew his heart. They knew what was really going on, and so it's just. And I think that's why the word courage is on the cover of that book. Just hanging in there sometimes is courage.
Running against the Wallace family in 1966 takes some courage.
And my recollection of that whole process was that Richmond Flowers' campaign was a campaign of bravado, of showmanship. Carl's campaign was one of courage and trying to really do something to help. There was a fella. I can't come up with his name now, but there was I believe he was a state senator from Tuscaloosa, who was running
DeGraff and Reed?
DeGraff and Reed, and got killed in a plane crash.
Yeah.
And I've heard members of the family say that if DeGraff and Reed had come on strong, Carl would have probably gotten out of it and supported him. But when DeGraff and Reed got killed in the plane crash on a campaign tour, the only moderate voice that had a chance was Carl at that point, and he decided to stay in and go full tilt with it. But you know, that's just, things work out that way.
Actually, in the book, there are some really interesting observations, kind of behind the scenes stuff, about this question of voting on civil rights legislation. It's not just Carl, it's quite a few of the Southern Democrats who felt that they had to vote against civil rights, but they talk quite freely when they're not in front of the cameras about the moral problem that they felt with this. And all this is detailed. You have these conversations of senators and representatives.
Lister Hill and John Sparkman, Bob Jones, who represented this district, they were statesmen, and it wasn't just Carl by himself. I know more about Carl's situation because of my circumstances and him being in my family, or me being in his family, I guess. But there were people in Congress and the Senate at that time from Alabama who the ones we have now couldn't carry their shoes, and they were statesmen, and they did things. You know, I'm sure they made their political deals, and there probably were some unsavory things that went on, but they did things that mattered, and they made they saw government as an institution to do good, make good things happen, and change people's lives in positive ways. And I'm not sure that attitude's around much anymore.
Well, your uncle was certainly a statesman.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate you saying that.
Can I ask you a more personal question?
Certainly.
You were for many years a judge. Was your career in that direction influenced by Carl's example?
Oh, yes. Yes. In fact, when I was initially elected district judge in Culver County, I was 29 years old, and I had dreams of bigger and better things. The realities of politics and marriage and children and everyday life dimmed some of those, but also I found myself in a job that I dearly loved, and I didn't, maybe it's rationalization, but I quit wanting to give it up for bigger and better things. I liked what I was doing. I felt like I was where I was supposed to be, doing what I was supposed to be doing, and was able to stay there and do that for 30 years, but I mean, I don't see how it could be otherwise, that my initial foray into the political world, I mean, it had to have something to do with me having those experiences that I had coming up, and the support of my family, and all, and just that whole array of experiences that I'd had.
Anything else you want to ask?
This has been wonderful to hear. I love the stories that you tell about being in Charles and watching your uncle be in Congress and go up and set foot on British soil. That's so great. I'm so curious. The one thing that keeps puzzling me, thinking I'm new to this area. I'm from Atlanta. And so one thing that puzzles me about Northwest Alabama is the story of civil rights is so different than 2 hours away in Birmingham. It's such a different narrative, and trying to tease out why that is. If it's interpersonal cooperation, if it has to do with the intervention of the federal government and the TVA, the presence of JFK and the helicopter, or if it has to do with class, that everybody's poor and we're all in this together. Just, it's interesting to hear you talk about that. Those are the questions that we've been muddling through this whole time.
I have, I don't have an answer for that, but I have an opinion about that, which is that this part of the state, the Tennessee River Valley part of the state, is so different. And down in Carl's district, the coal mine country and down that way, is so different from that part of the state which is south of Birmingham, the Black Belt. It's really, it's two different cultures. And my dad, I've heard him say many times that in a statewide political race, if there were two people running for, state auditor or whatever, and he didn't know either one of them, he would always, 100% of the time, vote for the one that lived north of Birmingham. And sometimes that was the only criteria he had. But in the it just seems to me inevitable that when the people through the Tennessee Valley were all poor together and all benefited from TVA together and all benefited from the Reynolds Metals Company and the industries that came, the post-World War II industries that came to the area. Folks benefited from those together, and we have to view race differently than the people in South Alabama who grew up with that plantation mentality. When we integrated the schools, when I was, as I said, in the 9th grade, there were poor white kids and poor black kids, and there were middle-class white kids and middle-class black kids, and they didn't. It wasn't so much of an us and them. I mean, they would come to school dressed like we were, and there was, it wasn't that all the white kids were in nice clothes and all the black kids were in ratty clothes. It was some of both. And I think that has to be because we never developed in this area that plantation mentality. I just don't have any other explanation. And that explanation may be completely wrong.
No, I think
but
you're
it's
right.
the only one I've done.
I think you're right. I do. It has to do with demographics. It has to do with industry. It has to do with the actual soil, the environment. Lots of factors that go back a long way. And I think that that's a big piece of it. It's interesting to hear you say that and to think hard about class and what it means to do the right thing for everybody, which your uncle did. Try to do the right thing unto all people. Give them education, give them opportunities that Americans deserve.
You know, he never in his in all of his days as a congressman, he never had to, for lack of a better term, pander to the black vote because there wasn't enough in his district to make any difference. And you know, they may not have been registered to vote anyway back in that day and time. So it was you know, he's a lot of times you know, touted as being ahead of his time on race and all that, and he was, but it really wasn't that at all. I mean, he was just ahead of his time.
In some ways, it seems that the tragedy in the narrative of the book is that because he set out to lift everybody through education and bookmobiles and the like, that meant inevitably that some of this help was going to go to black people, and that was what was used against him in the congressional level.
That's an accurate observation, I believe. That he inevitably he helped the wrong side. I think that's an accurate observation. I sure do.
So when emotions got really hot and the lines of cleavage between white and black got drawn more firmly in the 60s, then that could be used against him politically.
You know, and I don't believe, and people think I'm crazy, but I don't believe that George Wallace was ever a racist. I think George Wallace was an opportunist.
Yeah, you're right.
Because you know, if he had been a true ideological racist, he couldn't have switched gears like he did. I mean, he said and did whatever it took to get elected in 1962 and 1966. That's what it took. It was. And I think I said earlier that he had won 2 terms and couldn't run again, but that wasn't right. He'd only done 1 term, and there was a law in Alabama at that time that you could only serve 1 term. And you know, back in the Jim Folsom era, he would be in for 4 years, out for 4 years, in for 4 years. I think Folsom was governor 3 times, but it wasn't 3 consecutive times.
Well, it sounds like, from what I can tell, Wallace is a man who looked for the tide of popular opinion in order to get votes. And your uncle was the opposite. He stood for his principles, and sometimes he was elected, and sometimes he was not.
That's right. That's right. That's a good way to put that.
Well, we appreciate you
Thank you
taking
very
the
much.
time to share these stories.
It was fun. It was fun. I was all nervous about it, but it's turned
Not
out
too
okay.
scary. Well, we appreciate it. It's such interesting questions, and what a lovely conversation we've had, so thank you.
You are, you seem to me to be way too young to be interested in this, so I'm really excited that you are. I mean, I want this to live on, and it'll be the people of your generation that'll do that, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, again, this is Tom Osborne with Ansley Kiros. Before we close, I want to mention that this is a joint project with the Shoals Interfaith Council and the Florence-Lauderdale Public Library and the University of North Alabama. And our library tech person, faithfully sitting behind the camera, is Clint Alley. And we thank him for helping us with this interview.